All right. So let's maybe just start with the Reddit thread then.
Okay.
So first of all, I don't really get quite what you were trying to say with your bolding of variety and games in that first thing. So maybe tell me what you mean.
So the idea of variety in games, I suppose, means that there are more strategies available to play. That the RNG, I suppose, that the variance should be player provided, not computer provided. That the differences in the varieties of games that we face, it shouldn't be that, oh hey, in this game you were stuck on 2 power and that differs from the game that you perfectly curved out and everything in between. I mean, duh. But essentially, I think that what DWD is trying to do, they're saying, oh, we want variety, that you play the same matchup 100 times over and it's going to feel different, more often than if you had consistent power draw or something. And the thing is that if you do this thought exercise, that you rate both players' draws, 0 to 100%, like if you're playing Stone Scar and you're stuck on 2 and they're 2 shadow power and you have Oni Ronin, Pyro Knight, and Champion of Chaos in hand and you just can't play the game, you die. That's like a 0% draw. On the other hand, you're on the play, go Ronin, Instigator, Champion, Queen, Drake, and you just blow the opponent up. That's like 100% draw, right? So if you have 2 players, playing good decks, and one deck draws at 0 and the other deck draws at 100, you're not going to have a game. Like what happened with you, just now on your practice horn against, that Jito-less deck. They went, they have the play. They went Grendon Drone, then Grendon Drone Sangwar, Assembly Line, and you had all your top end. That's just not a game. Like, you literally didn't play a single card, before you conceded. And,
Yeah, but the thing that you like...
I think we want to do as much, ideally, we want to do as much as possible to avoid those kinds of events.
Yeah, but the thing is, a few things that you seem to be ignoring or forgetting or not understanding, there are a couple of things. First of all, variance cannot only come from players, and variance only coming from players does not lead to variance, because then you only get like some variety in deck choices or card choices, if any, and that's not creating like different games and different scenarios in games. That is created by not having the same things happen every game, and that is created by not drawing the same cards the same game and the same mix of cards every game. And the other thing is, of course, these like 0 versus 100 games, as you described them, suck. But another thing that you have to keep in mind in the example that you mentioned, first of all, being stuck on 2 shadow with your red 1-drops is first of all something that is extremely unlikely if you build your deck and your power base properly. Part of why it is so important in every 2-color deck to run for diplomatic seals, and there's still like probably 50% of the 2-color decks in this game that don't do it, and they just don't understand that they should. And examples like this are not a reason why variety or the influence power system sucks. They are an example why people suck at deck building and are ignorant to doing the best they can to reduce the variance. And the other thing is, you can simply calculate the probability of this happening, and you can bring something that Frank Carsten loosely set as a threshold for consistency was 90%, and I think that's a very reasonable value of percentage to say 90% is a reasonable percentage to consider something consistent 9 out of 10 times. Since it is hard to get these last 10%, because you get very little increase for adding more in these cases, like for example, getting from 90% to 100% of having a red on turn 1, for example, or having a red every game for your Oni Ronin or your Pyro Knight, basically means you're going to have to run like, I don't know, 70 red sources or something. So, or like 69, so you can basically not have an opening hand without them, which is not even possible in the game. But the thing is, you can very reasonably get to these 90%, for example. And that's another thing that people do not do with their power bases. And then if these things happen, they happen more often to people that deserve it. Because people that do their due diligence and build their power base properly, it will happen to them 10% or less of the games that they and it's also only 10% or less that they don't have a fire source in their opening hand. That still doesn't mean they also have only fire cards they cannot play. That means they might still have a mono shadow draw of like an Instigator and a removal and a Vara's Favor and a few red cards they cannot yet play but might draw the red source in a couple turns before it is too relevant that they didn't have fire in the first place, like for example a Champion of Chaos or whatever, or an Obliterate, or I don't know. Or a Torch they don't need early.
Absolutely, but I think like the game already takes care of that in some fashion. Like you put your 50 playables in, and you're running the 2-faction aggro deck, so you go 4 seat, 4 banner, 4 seal, hit add power, right? And usually that's the correct power amount, to be playing in terms of pure power.
No,
like,
it's not. Hitting add power is usually not something I'd recommend. Let's see what happens if you do that, honestly. Because I doubt you're going to get the proper amounts. We can look at the Stone Scar deck wins. Also, the other thing is running only 25 base power in most aggro decks is wrong. Because favors and seeks are slow and they make your aggro deck worse. And they also increase your chance to mulligan into 3 and 4 power opening hands, which is bad because every 4 power opening hand is basically a mulligan in most like real aggro decks. So having a chance to not only having the 33% chance to hit your 4 power on the redraw, but also having an additional percentage of having your 3 power hands, your 3 power redraws, and even your 2 power redraws occasionally become 4 power hands because you hit 1 favor on the 3 power redraw or 1 favor on the 2 power redraw is potentially devastating. Which is why the only aggressive decks that should realistically run favors, especially 4 and only 25 base power, are the big style Stone Scar decks that curve up to 5. And those are the only ones.
That's what Stone Scar is right now. Like the current Scar.
That's not true. There's like plenty of variety still. I mean, there's the deck that I'm just having in front of me that has plenty of upside over that. It's just probably a little more high variance in the tournament, but it's also more powerful. That's like the thing. If you play if you play both decks over a longer time in tournaments, play like, I don't know, 10 tournaments with each, you will probably, I'm fairly sure, have a better average with this one than with the bigger one that 3 of us played last weekend, among others, and Unearthly one with. Because my experience on ladder also with the bigger one is that it has much more middling results because it's also a much more middling deck. It has much less nut draw potential because it is much slower, has much more expensive cards that can be tempoed. Like if you drop like your Impending Doom and the opponent vanquishes it, that is a huge tempo swing to an aggro deck that you just can't even really do to these decks. Like if you vanquish anything here, it's gonna be like a 2-drop with a bunch of Warcry triggers and trading like even in power and so on. But anyway, let's click add power here. What you get is 7/7, and that's like not correct. What this needs is at least this. If it didn't have Beetle, if Beetle would be another red 1-drop, it should probably be this. Because your deck is like 8 red 1-drops, double red here, the triple red here being more important than the triple shadow overall, and also more reasonable to hit because you can't hit both, so you have to focus on making one more likely to be established, so it's always a 4-3 rather than sometimes a 5-3 and sometimes a 3-3, because being a 3-3 is really bad on champion, but being a 4-3 overwhelm is totally fine with queen and shot and weapons. And the deadly often is irrelevant because it's going to be a big guy anyway. And the deadly only becomes relevant again with the overwhelm, basically. And then there's only beetle, and your best one drop is also red, so you definitely want your 16 turn 1 red, because that's like the standard bare minimum for reliably having your one drop turn 1, basically. So yeah.
Right, but I mean, like,
Add power.
the power was pretty close.
Yeah, I mean, it's like also the red power, I think, the add power also only, I think, doesn't look at the amount of symbols you need. It only looks at the cards, and it sees 28 red, 29 shadow, which is why it suggests 7/7. But the fact that this is the same amount of cards in both colors, but much more fire symbols than shadow symbols, if you count all the influence symbols in the deck, the disparity will be towards fire and bigger, and a bigger gap than the 28-29. Alone because of 4 scepters and 4 queen. And even if you count both thresholds here equally, which I think you shouldn't, because the fire threshold is the primary one, that's the one that you put the card in the deck for. The deck is clearly a heavier fire leaning deck. And also if you look at the curve, the 1-drop slot is 2/3. That's like another thing that is important. When do you need the influence? And the deck on turn 1, the deck operates much better with a mono fire hand than a mono shadow hand. And on turn 2, it's like even. And on turn 3, once again, you want 2 fire, 1 shadow, and not the other way around, because the second shadow doesn't do anything for the deck at all. The only thing the second shadow does is get you 2/3 to a champion threshold. So the deck operates totally fine on triple fire, single shadow, which is why it is even fine to do this. The only reason I don't is because it's kind of nice to have champion turned on double a little more often, and we have beetle. But yeah,
right.
So that's the thing.
Yeah, but I mean, like the Stone Scar decks that won the Invitational and won the ETS the other day, they also use Countess and they also use Impending Doom. Like, you can't say Impending Doom is bad in Stone Scar.
I mean, I didn't say that.
Right. But essentially, like my thoughts are that we want to try as hard as possible to make sure that both players get to play. That we want the RNG to get out of the way of the players playing the game. That I remember when you were playing Owl Ramp, like for example, and you made like top 8, and then you were winning 2-1, and then game 4 you got flooded, and game 5 you got screwed. Something like that. Well, when something like that happens to you back to back, sure, it may be a rare event. That what's the chances of me flooding out to 16 without drawing an 8 of the Huru, and then the next game getting stuck at 2? Well, that's a very small chance. But nevertheless, if you had won that round, like you might have gotten to top 4, and then you might have qualified for the season 5 invitational because you had a good matchup against whichever the big combres I think was on the other side of the bracket, something like that. And the thing is that in tournaments that you're saying, like you have a 90% chance to hit 3 and, a 90% chance to hit 4, say you're 4-1, you're playing, you're in, you're BO3, you're tied 1-1, winning in, this last game, you're stuck at 2. You hit Snake Eyes, you roll the 1 out of 20, the 1 out of 10, you got stuck at 2, congratulations, you just got shown the door through no fault of your own. Your deck was good. It's been functioning well the whole day. You ran into a bad matchup. You lost a close one earlier, 2-1, 1-2. And then suddenly, you just got shown the door because stuck at 2.
The thing is,
that's never a good thing. That's always, very frustrating. Like on ladder,
And
you
that's
get
where
stuck
you're
at
wrong.
okay, hit the concede button, move on, who cares? You're playing, 10, 20, 30, 40 games a day. If you're streaming, maybe 100 games a day, nobody cares on ladder. In tournaments, every single time that you get stuck on power, that the RNG kicks you in the nuts, that matters.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're not looking at this the right way. The point is, first of all, it is more of a deck-specific and decision-based result than you think. Because the point is the following. What happened there in this matchup, even though it was frustrating, is something that is an age-old problem of this archetype. That's one of the main weaknesses of ramp decks, that they have a tendency to flood out, and they also have the potential, if you like the screw was like kind of unfortunate, but especially that flood part is just kind of an issue. The deck doesn't have that much card draw. Like, it has Ascendant, but the thing is, Ascendant is not super reliable, like often just gets shut down right away. And Aid of the Horror is like not helping with your variance because it happens at the end of everything. So that doesn't really count. So it doesn't have much that adds that much consistency there, and it always has like this issue of like drawing the right mix of ramp cards, power cards, and haymakers. And it's one of the ways that balances these archetypes, because honestly, if I get my power draws right with this our ramp in every matchup, the deck feels pretty hard to beat. So that's one of the ways that this deck, it's one of the weaknesses of the deck basically, and that's something that you have to keep in mind. That is not equally likely or doesn't happen for every deck the same way. And also, this game in that regard is like poker, except it's less extreme, as you have been lectured in your post. In poker, good tournament players cash 16 to 20% of tournaments. And I think in Magic, the top level pros are probably at a higher percentage, proving that there is professional and skill-based games that have a lot more variance than Magic or Eternal. I mean, to be fair, it's not like I think this variance is all PG and everything, but I think the general variance of the resource system is an inherent thing to the resource system, and something that also balances some of the upsides of it, and also generates a lot of intricacies in deck building choices. And a lot of what we are seeing in the extrema outliers of the variance are caused by people ignoring these choices or making poor choices in those areas. And the other thing is, there's no really good way of fixing it. I mean, I think the variance in Eternal is definitely higher than in Magic, and it can be a bit annoying, but I think that's not the resource system itself. The 75 card deck size relative to the low amount of stuff that adds consistency, smoothes out some issues. Right now, the game feels a bit too much pushed towards playing as many individually strong cards as possible. Don't have too much of a like synergy-based or focused strategy, other than like maybe being aggressive if there's good enough high quality aggressive units. But other than that, you mostly get rewarded right now in the game due to the deck size and the still same limit of 4 copies per card and lack of enough ways to balance your power draws, balance what you draw, like deck manipulation, stuff like that, or basically just enough cards that smooth out some of these issues. But that's another story. That's not the same kind of variance and the same thing that you addressed in the Reddit post. I mean, I definitely don't like that part too much either at the moment. I think it could all be like a little less forced into the value oriented, just play good cards, because you don't have that much way of manipulating how your draws work out, how the games pan out. So you just want to draw as many individually strong cards to get consistency in what your deck does, basically, because if you focus on synergies or relying on specific cards, the consistency is just not there to play them, and that limits the deck to the game to a lot of mid-range soup and some hyper efficient aggro decks in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely what I find, trying to play control and ladder. It's like you have to get as the control player, you need some pretty specific cards, to stay in the game. As the aggro player, you just want to, go threat. Can I get something to stick? Yeah, I got these 2 things to stick. I win because I whack you with a 2 attack and a 3 attack for 5 turns straight, and then burn you out or something like that.
Once again, though, that's mostly a typical best of one ladder syndrome that you have in ladder-based best of one games, because aggro decks, for example, are just naturally good game 1 decks that lose a lot of percentage post sideboard, and control decks are the other way around. Like control decks are like at best 50-55% decks, or even sometimes worse than that, game 1 decks, and gain huge percentages post sideboard, and that obviously hurts on ladder. And to be fair, there is good ladder control decks like Armory, Chalice, Big Combre.
Yeah, like
they're just like even Felon. Like Finkel just recently hit rank 1 with Felon, for example, but I don't think that Felon is like inherently a good deck, but it can work in the right circumstances, basically. So control is even like doing fairly well on ladder.
Yeah, that's also true. But I mean, like there's a lot of room, for improvement in the game. Like, the synergy based decks, they're basically non-starters. Oh, you want to play a Life Force deck? You never draw Catra, go home.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Like these more synergy driven things. The 75 card, the 75 card, the 75 card deck size is quite punishing for these things. The 75 card deck size is definitely hurting these things, and the lack of ways to, in a reasonable and moderate way, control some of your deck variants. Because if there is very little of that, you are kind of shoehorned, forced into just putting as many individually strong cards in your deck. Because if you can't control reasonably well enough how reliably you see specific cards a game, obviously it shouldn't be too reliable. That's the other thing. Too good card draw, too much tutoring. The way you sometimes imagine it, also not good. But it could be like, the situation could be better than it is now. Also, it doesn't have to necessarily be like deck manipulation or anything. Just, I don't know, like some more inherent ways to make things a little smoother. Because a lot of the good cards are just like raw, powerful type stuff, but nothing that is subtly good, like that generates like some nice consistency, like some scries and stuff. There's like this scry 1 since set 2, and it's mostly attached to not very good, very constructed relevant cards, for example. And these are effects that are not super powerful, but just tie things a little together and give you a bit more control over how things pan out or whatever. So that's stuff
like extract is all right, but only all right. Pummel, it's basically, I don't have Finest Hour or I don't have Rapid Shot. Like which means you're not in Justice or you're not in Shadow, which means your aggro deck is probably not all that good. Skycrag just got kneecapped. I don't know why. Like, the developers could have, changed the power surge to be 1+, instead of 2+. Because we're never going to see Flail again. Flame Blast is basically, you're in big practice. You're generating a ton of power. You're at 11 power. You draw Flame Blast. Here, hold this 10 damage bomb to your face. And Copper Conduit will never, ever, ever be seen again, in its current state. But also, regarding, like the deck manipulation, like that's what infuriated me about the Inspire nerf, because now that card's unplayable. Like, it's basically every single time that decks get somewhat too consistent, it's like, oh, this deck is too consistent. We're going to, make its consistency unplayable. And it's like frustrating because, you want to have a plan. Like, even Armory, like Tony G's Armory, it's like you want to draw your artisans, a couple of artisans early, and then, you want to draw a weapon. Or a couple of weapons. Like, I'm sure everyone that's played a lot of games with Armory has had games, like that they lost to Found Control with Armory, and the Found Control is playing Novara, and it's like, okay, so in my top 20 cards, they didn't draw a single artisan, or they draw 3 artisans and they never draw a weapon. That's frustrating because it's like, well, my deck was built correctly, my deck works well, on average, but essentially, the analogy, I've seen is take a drunk walking across stumbling across a busy highway. On average, the drunk is on the yellow line between the traffic, and so on average, the drunk is alive. But in reality, the drunk is almost always dead. Because he's usually in one lane of traffic or the other. And the question is, essentially...
Yeah, but that metaphor doesn't apply to card games properly, because
the question is,
there's no yellow line and dead left and right of it, because that's exactly where you're wrong. Like, left and right of... Like, basically the thing is the yellow line is the no decision zone mostly. Because the yellow line mostly is deck plays itself. The decisions and the skill happens left and right of the decision line in the car lanes, where you have to dodge those cars and try to survive in the oncoming traffic, basically, to liquid your metaphor.
Right. That. Well, I mean, like for example, Booker 213, I've seen has said, if every deck worked perfectly, every game that would be a game would, it'd be a game with a short shelf life.
That's I agree with that, just based on experience.
Like I've actually played such a game before. It was called Ulteal.
See, I haven't even heard of that game.
Yeah, because it was so mismanaged. Because every single card, took like 1 month, in 1 month in Eternal, you could have like a top tier deck. You could have like Stone Scar Queen. You'll have your Bandit Queens. You will have, your Soulfire Drakes if you want them, and you'll be a happy camper with your progress. In that game, you were lucky to make one good deck in 3 months, and it would be a budget deck. And if you wanted all the cards, you could pay thousands of dollars and still not have all the cards. So the accessibility issue just, was such a huge issue in the game, especially because, hey, you got your one good deck. It's an amazing deck. It wins, and you're able to get a 75% win rate with it. And along comes the nerf train and just kneecaps you. And suddenly, now you have to scrounge around for another 3 months just to be competitive again. That game died horribly because of that reason. But the gameplay itself was it was a sort of Magic meets Tactics. Like, you start off with 5 mana, you got 2 mana per turn, and you basically had to conserve that, and you could only play 1 card at most per turn. And you had 9
let
spaces
me
to
cut
deploy
you a bit
units.
short there. I don't want to dive too much into some obscure game that I have never heard of, and I think that's just not helpful.
But essentially, like, the variance came between, units targeted random enemy units. Like, when they attacked, they could target one of 3 units that was in range. Or there was this thing called agility. Like we have quick draw, means your unit either does damage first or it doesn't. That game had 5 different levels, 1 through 5. 5 went first. And so those roles decided things, but the variance was much reduced. And
I mean, it's a different kind of variance, and it's fine. But that's the thing: you have to have variance in card games, and this game has most of its variance focused around an interesting resource system that gives you a lot of possibilities and room for creativity and deck building, but also can be very punishing if you don't do your homework. But the thing is, that's only one option, only one system of a card game. There's others out there. If people don't like this kind of variance, like you seem to hate this variance so much, there's other games that have their variance aspect put in another aspect. Like, for example, the Elder Scrolls Legends. It obviously has no resource variance. It is more of a Hearthstone-like game with some minor card variance, like much less and much more healthy, I think, from what I've seen so far, variance than Hearthstone. But basically, it is more the kind of variance that you described with this other game. Because as you see, these games need variance, and both systems have their up and downside. I even have started playing Elder Scrolls Legends a while ago, and I think it's a pretty cool game, and it's just different. And the variance there has different appeals, and also the the different resource system has different up and downsides, because the deck building is much more linear. There's much less creativity. There's also much fewer creative things you can do with your power base, and also edges that you can gain by having a better power base, by having more flood protection, by eking out every tiny ounce there, or even creatively and with restraint splashing like a third color to add something without hurting your deck too much and balancing these things out. These things don't exist in that game, but other things exist. It's just apples and oranges. They're just different sides, and that game has its issues and its negative sides the same way as this type of game has. And that's the thing. It's kind of like, in terms of variance, pick your poison. It doesn't work without, and I think Richard Garfield explained very well, put very well, why variance and skill are not like mutually exclusive, and that even variance creates a lot of room for skill, actually. And I'm not sure if I ever like saw it that way before, like looked at it that way, because a lot of the skill potential and possibilities for the intricate decisions in Magic and Eternal come from the variance, because if everything is working peachy, a lot more people can make the right decision in the game than the people that aren't, because then it comes to a very deep understanding of the game, of the deck, of the matchup, of a long-term view on how this game is going to shape up, and how you most likely turn this bad situation into a winning one. And even if it's a low percentage, multi-out kind of situation, doing everything, keeping that in mind, and playing to your outs and that stuff. And that's where the real skill comes in, because curving out with your deck properly and just playing your good cards, like especially with these mid-range decks, is like a no-brainer for anyone that is Masters level or even Diamond level player in this game. And that's would not be a particularly interesting game, and also would not lead to an increase in skill on that.
Sure. But I mean, like, essentially, my question is, can and should Eternal trying to reduce its variance so that the edges better players have, like, increase? For example, like, if you look at LSV's, Hall of Fame page, that in Constructed, he has something like a 64% win rate, and Magic has less variance than Eternal. So in Eternal, a top level player like Unearthly or you or me or Angry Chicken might have even less of a win percentage. When the rubber meets the road. For example, Angry Chicken turns it on when it comes to tournaments, and he's fantastic for that. But essentially, like, when the best players have a 60% win rate and you have a 55% win rate, does that mean you're doing something wrong, or does that just mean a small sample size? Like, if you could say, if the best player could say,
both.
like you're doing something wrong with this deck because I'm getting a 75% win rate and you're getting a 55% win rate. You could say, hey, I'm going to, stream my games and get feedback. Where am I making, complete blunders? And things like that. But when the difference between, top players and another player is like, 60% versus, 57.5%, then it's like, when you lose a game, did I lose that because I made a mistake, or did I lose because my opponent outdrew me? Like, okay, my opponent had to play when Ronin, Instigator, Champion, Queen, Drake, and just curved me out. Okay, he got the nuts. I can respect that. I got stuck at 2.
The thing is, though, in a lot of these games where it's like, oh, he had the nuts, there is still like plenty of games that you lose because it's your fault and not because they had everything. Because there were like games. For example, there was a game the other day. I think there was a game last night that I played on Skype with Sarius, and I made a mistake and lost, and the opponent had like a really good draw and had like everything, and the focus afterwards, like the first thing that came out of Sarius' mouth was like, yeah, well, your opponent like had literally everything. I was like, yeah, no, that doesn't matter because I could have still won. So it's not like he won because he had everything. He won because I let him win, and that's my fault and not blaming on the draw. And like that's what you'll see a lot. Like people blame things on draws and like, oh, he had everything, and don't see that like one misstep they made that managed that they lost, that the window closed where they could beat the opponent having everything.
Yeah, but like, how often is that the case? Like, if it was the case that that the best players are the ones that see the window all the time and can pull out a win whenever, like, what would the win rate of someone like Unearthly, like Angry Chicken, like yourself be? Shouldn't it be much higher than it is now? Shouldn't we see some sort of elite of the elite player that wins 70% of the time or something?
We don't even have an incentive for that yet. Like, I'm fucking dicking around in the ETS every weekend because I don't even really care much. Like, I play when I have nothing better to do, basically, and also because I can just stream at the same time anyway, and play like a different deck every week, like whatever I feel like is kind of reasonable to play, and I would like to try in a tournament setting to see how it does in a tournament setting, or whatever. Like, there's not even incentive for anything, and yet you try to compare win rates from like ETS people with someone like LSV that probably has a ridiculous constructed win rate even by Pro Tour Hall of Famer standards.
He has a 64% win rate. Do you consider that ridiculous?
I think it's probably ridiculous because I don't have any other numbers in play in my mind, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the combined win rate of like some of the best players are slightly below 60% lifetime, because that's just the reality of what these games are. They are games of small edges, and they are and like the win rates, the long-term win rates of really good players are not that high because it's just not possible in these games.
Well, I mean, that's
Exactly, yes, yeah.
essentially the question I'm posing. Like, this is a digital card game. This has an MMR to match players of similar skill. Swiss tournaments.
And that's one of the
try and
big
match
things
records.
that you got wrong in your Reddit post, assuming that some random MMR that is like half decent working and matching you with like sometimes matching like silver players with masters players if there's nobody else around, means that you don't need variance all of a sudden to give a game mass appeal. It's just nonsense, honestly. It's just delusional and ignoring reality and living and thinking in some utopia that doesn't exist.
Oh, and a quick reply to Duckris. I like to watch fighting games. I think Evo is fucking amazing. The reason I don't is it requires a shit ton of dexterity. But the strategy, the mind games that go into fighting games, I actually do enjoy. There's definitely an enjoyment to that. It's just that type of game is only made by one person named David Serlin, and it's called Fantasy Strike. I recommend you look into it, but it's still in very early
Let's get dangerous.
But I'm keeping my eye on that game. So you're correct. Yeah, you are definitely correct. But I fully hear you there. But yeah, like the thing is that right now I'm not sure if Eternal has enough of a player population, which is why you sometimes see a silver player ranked up against a master player, because he got the lucky side of variance for a few games, and he's on a winning streak, and the MMR thinks, oh, this gold 1 player is at my level, and then I run into him and stomp him. Sure, that'll happen. But for example, like when Magic was designed, it was designed, with the idea that you had, small pockets of players, because this was before the internet.
Yeah, I read that that post, and I also read the comment below from that guy that you said he gets it, but I think honestly you are not getting it, because I think that's not the only argument. I mean, there is a big reason why so many people play Hearthstone, why millions of people play Magic, and not so many people play chess. And that still holds true today. And some random MMR cannot make up for that. An MMR can also, like, the Garfield explained that in the video, basically. I think it was Garfield. I think it was in the Garfield video. How you basically have this group of people, and there's like exactly one person that is at just the right level of skill to create an enjoyable game for the two of you, for both of you, and every other opponent would just create like a one-sided kind of boring, unappealing game. And do you really think an MMR can measure that like remotely well enough to give you like an interesting, appropriate opponent every game? It doesn't. You will just get one-sided, like lopsided games most of the time, and that just kills these games. I mean, that's another thing. Booker mentioned Versus System earlier. I loved Versus System. Versus System was a really cool game, a really great concept, but the problem was the game was pretty low variance. There was basically only the variance of the draw, and only the variance of the draw. Literally nothing else in terms of variance. And the game was very complicated in its combat. Like even the best players in the game hardly made it through a combat step without making like at least one mistake, which had a lot of appeal to competitive players. And the first Pro Tour in that game was more than 50% MTG pros in the top 8. I think Kibler, among others, top 8 in that pro circuit, and I think Gabe Waltz and a couple others. Anyway, that game unfortunately didn't live that long, partially because it seemed to not have enough mass appeal, probably due to the variance situation and the complexity level, which is unfortunate because the game was still like really great and had enough variance for like a competitive player to be appealing with the variance of the draw and stuff. But yeah, it was probably one of the games that was a bit closer to the Hearthstone, Elder Scrolls kind of school of games, but only to an extent, because it basically had a, like, do you know the game?
I have not. I've never played it.
Do you know WoW
Sounds
TCG?
like something I would have enjoyed.
Do you know WoW TCG?
Do I know what?
WoW TCG. The
WoW
game that got
TCG.
game that got scrapped for Hearthstone because Blizzard wanted its IP back for
Oh,
Hearthstone.
WoW TCG.
So
I've
they
seen it played. I've never played it myself.
because that was basically
Okay.
the same school of card game, although it was a bit like a bit more traditional combat, like Hearthstone style combat, and back to classic. Basically, the thing is, both games had a nice resource system in a way, because there was basically no colors. They solved the deck building thing through tribes. Like there was a lot of tribal thing, and I think tribal synergies. So it made sense to put cards that synergize with each other in a deck. I think you could basically play all the tribes, but it just would be bad because your cards would be not working properly or underpowered. So that is kind of what forced you to be like two-colored or monocolored or whatever, like mono tribal or like duo tribe or whatever. And basically every card could be played face down as a resource. In versus system, you would start, I think, with 4 cards as an opening hand, or was it 7? I'm not quite sure. It might have been 7, like in Magic. Too long since I last played it. And you would draw 2 cards a turn. I think you start at 4 cards. I'm not sure if it was 7. Anyway, you draw 2 cards a turn, and then you basically can play a card per turn face down as resource, and there were a lot of cards that you even could still use after you played them as a resource. Like there were some cards that you could play as a resource and then flip them over to make them do something. Because this, for example, the spells in the game, you could all spells, you could play them face down as a resource and then flip them over at will to use them, to play them basically. And they had like a threshold system. They had no cost.
That honestly sounds like a fantastic idea, honestly.
Yeah, it was a great idea. The game was great. And
for example, imagine if we had no power in Eternal, but instead you put together 75 playables which you could flip over, any one of which you could flip over, to be a power. So, for example, like if you were taking a Stone Scar deck instead of your Fire Sigils and, your Seeds and Banners, that you'd instead have, Infernal Tyrants and Voprexes and something like that. And it's like, okay, well, my opening hand is Onironin Outlaw, Bandit Queen, Champion of Chaos, Voprex, Infernal Tyrant, and, Flamestoker. So turn 1, I'm going to flip over my Voprex to have the same effect as a Seep. I think that would actually make a more interesting Eternal. That may completely suck out all the variants and it'd be a completely different game. But such a game I think would create more decisions. Would maybe create more decisions. Like which card do I flip over? To make a resource.
Yeah, it definitely creates a lot of interesting decisions. But the problem is it also has the potential to lead to what happened with versus system. Make it too consistent, make it too low variance, make it too low in mass appeal. Like WoW TCG was also like not doing so well for similar reasons. Although the variance in WoW TCG I think was a bit bigger. In WoW TCG it was pretty similar. You basically drew regular like 7-card opening hand, I think, and like 1 card per turn, and you could play any card face down as like a land basically. And but there were not many cards I think that could still do something after you played them face down as a land. So it was basically a card that you play face down as a resource and won't do anything else this game. I guess there was some stuff, for example, where you could return a resource to your hand and then basically if you have had to play like a good card early on as land, you can maybe like use something later to bounce it back to your hand if you don't need it as a resource anymore and play it as a card and stuff like that. And yeah, like WoW TCG had some power creep issues as Booker mentions.
Look, I
And
mean,
the thing is like
the assertion.
The thing is
Go
you are
ahead.
trying to turn Eternal into something that it's not. And that will never happen. There's different flavors of card games for different preferences. There's the Hearthstone. Like the two major schools of thought right now are Magic and Hearthstone. And there's
Well, I mean, like
a couple of games in the vein of Hearthstone. The two main ones being Hearthstone and Elder Scrolls Legends. I think Elder Scrolls is a much more appealing Hearthstone, personally. And there's Magic-like card games like Magic, Eternal, like what's the other one called? From Corey and those guys. The Magic clone.
I mean, like,
do you know which one I mean?
You know,
Help
games...
me. What game is it? Hex. Thanks, Imrahil. Hex is what I was thinking. I don't know anything about Feria other than the name. I meant Hex, because that's from Magic players as well. I think Corey Burkhardt or Baumeister, I think Corey Burkhardt is working on it among others. The modern Crixus control master, basically. Yeah, so these are the different styles of games, and then there's a game like Gwent that is more like chess from what I know and like completely different again. And WoW TCG and Versus system, especially WoW TCG, would be fairly comparable to a higher variance of the draw, lower variance of RNG kind of Hearthstone, because the combat worked the same. You attacked units. There was no blocking. It was like a Hearthstone style combat system, and there was no RNG cards. I think no card at all with RNG, or the same amount as in Magic, which is close to none. And the variance came from draw variance, while in Hearthstone there's so little draw variance with 30 cards, and not having to use actual cards as resources, but getting resources automatically eliminates that. So it's more or less a spin on the Hearthstone type thing. Like Versus system was a bit different again. Versus had like a simultaneous turn. Every step of a turn would happen at the same time. Just initiative would switch. Like the player that has initiative takes the step first, then the other person. Like for example, I play my lands and play my units because I have initiative first. Then my opponent has initiative. He plays his land and his units. Then it's combat step. I have initiative. I get to attack first. He gets to defend. Then after I attacked, he gets initiative. If he can still attack back, he gets to attack, and that switches every turn. So it's like a more simultaneous kind of thing. And the combat was a bit Hearthstone-like, but only a bit Hearthstone-like, in the sense that there was no attacking and blocking. There was a direct attacking of units, but units wouldn't just die. Units would get stunned if they would die. And at the end of each turn, all but one stunned unit would die. So you basically have to kill more than one unit per turn to even actually kill a unit. And there's a formation step. You have like 2 rows of units, and the first row protects the second row, and like flying in this game basically meant that you could fly over the first row and attack stuff in the second row and stuff, because you basically arranged your units so that the first row protects the second as well as possible, and so on. And so you have some strategic positioning to do before combat begins, the one with initiative first. So basically that's kind of a disadvantage, because then the guy on the defense sees what you're roughly going for, so he can try to mitigate the damage as much as possible by adjusting his stuff accordingly, and then wait for impact. And after the dust has settled, he can like retaliate with whatever is left. And you basically need to try to... You can't even like guaranteed kill a specific unit. You can only basically always kill the second best unit, because you kill the best and the second best unit, and then they save the best and the second best dies, for example. They always get to
Right, I mean,
keep their best unit and stuff like that. It was pretty complex, and the combat step was super deep and super strategic, and there was so many levels to play it, which was super intriguing, but it was also super hard.
I mean, that sounds like something very cool that hey, if you lose, you can, like, an expert player, could look at your game and say, yeah, you made a mistake here because, you didn't arrange these units correctly, or you attacked the wrong unit, and that if you lost, you could learn from that if you wanted to. That the problem with these higher variance games is it's harder to learn from a loss, because, it's like, these
games are hard. You got it. These games are hard. That's right.
Like my philosophy would be that in a game, either you win or you learn. Like, when you get power screwed, what do you learn? You learn nothing. Because, hey, that can happen. Suck it up and move on. Or if you're 1-1, you're 4-1, in a 6-round switch.
I mean, you can learn plenty in screw games. You cannot learn something in the you cannot necessarily learn something in the super extreme non-games that you mentioned, which are super extreme outliers, like drawing your double shadow mono fire hand in your fire heavy aggro deck or whatever. But what you can possibly learn is that you should maybe revisit, double check your power base and see if it's actually right and was just bad luck. But there is potential to learn in most games, and there's also, like, always the potential to not learn from a loss in each game, really. The fact that every game that you can learn from every game, you can win or learn from every game, in any game, really, or almost any game, is just not realistic.
Essentially, I think you're making the assertion that these high variance games have a larger amount of mass appeal, because if you get these super deep games that a Brian Kibler or a Manu S or an Unearthly will 99 times out of 100, just dumpster a worse player, that you're going to have people quitting in droves. And I'm thinking, I think the reason that Hearthstone has the mass appeal it does, and Overwatch has the mass appeal it does, is that Blizzard is a master at production values. Like, Diablo 3 is a shitty game that sold millions and millions because the graphics were good, the response, the responsiveness was good, the controls felt good, and Hearthstone is very polished. It has a lot of animations. The voice work is good. The client is all shiny. There's lots of music going around, and so people are just generally enjoying themselves. And I think that even if Hearthstone was a much lower variance game, just the fact that Blizzard is such a master at production values, well, the Oversmurf, Diablo 3's graphics were good, compared to the other ARPGs of the time. Like what would you have? You had Diablo 2, you had right, like obviously Path of Exile is much better now, but when Diablo 3 was just starting, it was would have to go to compete with, Titan Quest, Hellgate London, which failed, Torchlight, which is very niche, and essentially Diablo 2. But Blizzard really started off strong and just dropped the ball eventually. But with Hearthstone, Overwatch, it's essentially you have these extremely well done production values with thousands of man hours put into them. And I think that if Blizzard created any sort of game there, it doesn't matter what kind of game Blizzard would create, so long as the gameplay was legitimately good, like just drop the ball in Diablo 3. But if it was a legitimately good game, even if it had a different philosophy, I still think you'd have millions of people playing it. I don't think you'd have people saying, I quit because this game is boring or this is broken or yada 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 yada, any number of things. Like I'm not sure it's it's the fact that a game is deep and has a lot of complexity that kills mass appeal. Like when you say, oh, millions of people play Hearthstone, very few people play chess, well, because what are chess's production values? You have a board and you have 16 pieces, and there's no real way to glitz that up, to make moving those pieces more
but that's
enjoyable.
not the only thing. The other thing is simply that chess is very dry, chess is very repetitive, chess is very complicated and sort of exhausting if you're really trying. And also it's a lot at a higher level, a lot about memorization, and it's just not fun.
Like,
chess is
you're
not like actually fun.
Which is why I stopped playing it. Because
yeah, but you want card chess.
Okay, well because you have the same 16 pieces and they're in this they're in the same position all the time, and you just have to memorize endless lines of openings instead of trying to outthink your opponent, which is why Bobby Fischer, a famous chess player, said that chess would be much better if we had equal randomized positions at the beginning of every game.
I watched
memorizing the queen's gambit or e4 e5 king's pawn mirrors, that every single game players had to be creative. And I think that's the appeal of games like Eternal, like Magic, because you have full freedom in deck building. Like you could play aggro, you could play control, you could play midrange.
Yeah, but it is completely besides the point and pointless to argue things Eternal outside the confines of Eternal. Because Eternal has the resource system it has. It will not change that. It chose deliberately to use the resource system it chose. And it never at any point questions the resource chain. I honestly, to some extent, am a bit sad about the mulligan, the redraw change that they made when they made it, because I think that to some extent exacerbates this decision, because people getting initially less punished for their poor deck building choices and getting more into the habit of blaming it on bad luck and variance and less looking for faults themselves, because if their redraw already would punish them every time for their bad deck building decisions by showing them every time on their redraw as well that even the second time around your deck is not going to give you the right amount of power because it's not in there, then people would be more inclined after a while to reconsider their deck building choices and maybe put more power in there. Because now this opening hand, this redraw change gives you the illusion of your deck functioning, of your deck being like build functional when it isn't. A deck with the power base that Sunnyvale played and unearthly copied to win this weekend is half functional. And it's absurd that they even both ran hot enough to win tournaments with it. It's past my mind. And then using that as an example in a thread as there would have been another grand finals decided by power issues because he got stuck on 3 the first 2 games. Exactly, because being stuck on 3 with this deck is almost running average.
Let's get
That's the thing. Hitting 3 power with that power base is almost running average. Maybe slightly below average. Probably. I'm not 100% sure. I wouldn't even know how to calculate the average for that, but the deck is definitely not built to reliably hit 5 power. It's okay at most of the time hitting 4. So 3 is a bit below average probably.
But I mean, like with Stone Scar, like you're okay with being stuck at 4 because most of your cards cost 4. Like okay, you have 2 Obliterates and a Drake stuck in hand. That doesn't feel good, but by the time you're stuck
Booker, the 1-6 was a nice change because that was cutting off unnecessary variance that was not realistically, there was like statistical outliers that didn't punish anyone for anything, but the redraw kind of like cushions people with bad power bases. So I was a bit flustered actually with that change when they made it, especially because they basically mentioned the situation of people not putting enough power, like proper power amounts in their decks, and then they change the redraw in a way that it punishes them even less and makes it incentivizes people more to just not give a fuck and hope to get there more often than not. Because if you're starting with like around 3 power on average, your deck is at least like half functional, and for the rest you're just kind of flipping the coin if you ever see more than those 3 power or not. But and if you don't, you just blame it on bad luck because you got screwed.
well, I mean, like
I was just responding to Booker.
Like no, I understand, but you know that can also go go in your calculation, like hey, you know, if I'm two power on the play, I'm usually gonna throw that back because I don't want to get stuck at 2, and I think I have a better chance of
I'm not saying that you cannot
guaranteed.
use it properly. I'm just saying that it gives people, like people that don't properly assess their power bases, the illusion, especially people that shortcut, the illusion that their deck is functional, and that's a bad thing because it disincentivizes people to properly build their power bases, and also makes it less likely for people to eventually get the hang of the situation, be like, hey, maybe it's just the way I built this deck that this happens over and over, that even my redraws are kind of shitty. And that I keep getting
Yeah, I mean,
these,
like,
like, you know, if
yeah,
you're if the percentage of power you get on your redraw is connected to the amount of power you have in your deck, then the average structure of your redraw is relative to the general structure of your deck, and then you keep recognizing a pattern. If your pattern is I have too much power, your redraws will kind of reflect that. And if the pattern is your deck has too little power, your redraw will reflect it.
You know what I wish would happen, that you'd have more draws that are characteristic of your deck. Like if you've ever played Rakano and you know you got
It
one
kind of is, Booker. And I'm trying so hard to get people out of that.
Like if you have ever had those games with Rakano that you know, like you drew 1 Oni Ronin and 2 scepters and 2 hammers of might and 2 plates, and your Oni Ronin ate a torch, and then you know you're just like stuck with 6 weapons, and you know you draw 5 power in 1 unit.
That restriction over master actually restricts their design space in the future, because they have to be careful that abuse, that redraw 50 power abuse has potential to come back to bite them and might deny them some releasing some stuff that they otherwise could, because it would be abusable with the redraw. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just trying to also interact with chat.
Decks are meme decks. I don't think they'll ever be good. But
right now, yeah. But that's I'm saying that it limits their design space in releasing some powerful synergies, because the 50 power situation has the potential to make these blow back on them. So they have to be careful with strong interactions, because they have to keep the 50 power deck in mind and make sure that it's not ending up with a broken deck. You know?
Sure. But like you're saying, like you know, hey, on the redraw, I wish people would get power characteristic, you know, to their deck. Like if they put 25 power, you know, in their deck, that they're usually going to have 2 power hands, and the redraw is going to be 2 power. And I actually like that idea, because that means that by putting in some, you know, more power in my deck, that I sort of know when I'm going to be drawing more power, and I should flood less, I should screw less. But essentially, the redraw system means we're trying to prevent flood. As players, we are really scared of flooding out. Because if you're Stone Scar, and you go 1, 2, 3, miss 4, miss 5, start flooding.
That's not, I don't agree with that. I honestly am much more scared of being screwed with almost every deck and almost every game, because flood is something that is much more manageable in most cases with most decks than screw. Except for the low to the ground aggro decks, but they're also not very likely to flood because you build them accordingly. But yeah, even with big Stone Scar with Burn Queen style decks, I am usually more scared of screwing than flooding, because if the deck gets stuck on 3, it's a pile of poop. If you can't play your 4-drops and hit your 5th power before it's too late, the deck just doesn't beat shit most of the time.
Right. I mean, it's always that balancing act, but because of the redraw, we are trying to keep from flooding out, because essentially the moment you start
that's
flooding,
the thing. Screw means you're not getting to play a game. Flood means you get to play a game on what is a good word for it? Flood means you still get to play a game, but you are kind of the poor person. You don't have all the stuff that the average Joe has that makes a healthy wage. You're kind of like the poor guy scraping by, but you're still alive. While with a screw, you're not even a poor guy, you're just a dead guy. So that's stick with that metaphor. That's why it makes no sense for people to be so irrationally more concerned with flood, especially because flood does not mean 1 power too much, while screw often can already mean 1 power too few. Flood starts with a string of excess power that you have no use for, really, and that's something that smaller adjustment in power has much less impact on, because it's just a low variance outlier sort of anyway, while the constant screw missing a critical land drop is much more impacted by your power base being 2 power off or not.
Sure, but
something that I have been trying to educate about for as long as I make content.
No, I mean, but the thing is, even the mid-range decks, for example, you could see that, for example, in Big Combre, that philosophy of not having something to do is such a fear. For example, even Angry Chicken's Big Combre, Big Combre, the deck that wants to just draw power, it wants to hit 15 power. Even that deck, 4 seek power,
I mean, it doesn't
2
want
find the way.
to hit more power.
Sure, you had your Iron Thorns, that can help,
I mean, the deck doesn't want to hit 15 power.
or whatever it is. But even
what the deck actual wants to hit realistically is 6 or 7, 7.
Big Combre?
Yeah. 15 is not a goal of the deck, that's just the super late game that happens. What the deck is built for is to get to 6 to 7. Because you need that, you want that 7 for your Ascendant to go 6 on 6 Ascendant plus power, but that's your last actual play. The rest is flood protection and stuff that kind of casually happens.
You want to get to 8, I think, for Seraph and Parliament to actually...
Eventually, but it's not something that you need. The deck is not built to naturally hit 8. That's why you have Martial Iron Thorns, for example, to get you to 8.
Yeah, I mean...
Iron Thorn is the card that gets you to 8. Without Iron Thorn, the deck probably meant to hit I don't know.
For example, Big Combre has, I'd say, 31 sources, right? Unearthly's deck had, and Sunnyvale's Stone Scar, it's trying to hit 5. It's trying to hit 5 and stop, maybe 6 for Pyronite. Like it's trying to hit 5.5.
Yeah, but you're looking at that too one-dimensional. That's the thing. First of all, there's people that run a third find a way in Combre. I, for my part, have actually ran like 3 to 4 find a way, often 3 and 1 privileger rank, and 27 power no seek, which is basically also 31. But the thing is, 4 of these cards give you 2 resources, which basically means with the 31 individual cards that give power, your deck is reasonably well set up to hit 5. Like 31 is a good amount to reliably hit 5. And once the deck reliably hits 5, it's fine, because it has Iron Thorn, and 4 of these 31 cards give me a second power, so you can basically break down these 4 extra powers over the 31 total sources, so the deck basically has like 1.x resources per one of these 31 resources. So probably with 4 find a way type effects in 31, you could maybe look at it as like 32 to 33, and then you have the Iron Thorns to catapult you basically to 7 or 8. Because the deck is in fact not that great at getting past 5 or 6 without Iron Thorn. But the deck doesn't need to get much further than 5 without Iron Thorn. The deck operates in that regard much similar to Armory in a way, but also has a lot of things to do to afford to maybe like hit and not always hit that 7th land drop, for example. But you really, really need that 5th all the time. But the 5 are fine with 31 with 31 power, especially when 2 to 4 out of these 31 sources mean you immediately get 2 drops. And that's why it works. And the thing actually is, a 7/5 drop Stonescar deck needs those 31 too. It just doesn't need the find-a-ways for the double stuff, and can maybe afford to run a couple of monuments to buffer, to make the 31 not a hard 31 or a hard plus 31 like in Big Combre where it's 31 plus, while in Stonescar it would be like a soft 31 with like 31 minus, because I don't know, 2 would be monuments that can be used as resources otherwise once you hit your actual 5, if you draw it as a 6th resource, and you also have the Various Favor, which are almost a spell in that deck, making double duty and therefore not punishing you, especially since the deck also still has turn 6 plays with Pyro Knight.
Like
basically, yeah. That's about right, Booker. It's a bit less than 33. It's a bit smaller than 33% though, because you can still get the 2 power, 2 power seek or 2 power find a way hand, and then you're fine. But yeah, you probably have like a 30 to a bit more than 30% chance of just sort of dying there. But yeah, that's another part of that I'm not super happy with the mulligan, because it kind of treats all decks equal, and there's nothing you can do about being treated equal, except that there's some strategies that just flat out get like a 30%, like a 30-ish% close to losing percentage from the redraw, because some redraw outcomes are almost death sentences for some decks, making these decks less viable. Like for example, getting the 4 power redraw is punishing for aggro, but it's okay. It's not like necessarily a death sentence, especially in an aggro deck that has a good enough curve. Like the aggro decks that I usually postulate mostly, like the Stonescar deck that I showed earlier, like the one topping at 4 with 26. If that deck hits 4, sure, it is probably gonna draw 1 to 2 power too many this game than it needs, because it usually wants to stop at 4, but it still at least has the flood protection of both Pyro Knight and also doing like 2 things on 5 and stuff, so it gets some mileage out of these. And since the curve is low and redundant enough, it at least still always gets a good opening, while these bigger Stonescar decks, if they get 4 power opening hands, they might get something like, I don't know, a removal, a 4-drop, and a favor. And that seems a bit more like a Death Sentence opening hand in a way. While the other deck is just forced to, it's just relying a bit more on drawing more spells than power off the top, which is fine because the deck is 2/3 non-power cards and 1/3 power, and you already have more than 1/3 power in your opening hand. So the ratio of power to non-power cards in your deck at that point is around, I don't know, 67%, 68% or something. So you are in a reasonable shape. There will still be games where you flood out a bit more and lose, but that's also fine. There has to be some punishment for redraws. It just can't get like in the same or better chance. I guess there just has to be some risk involved in redraws to make redraws a decision. I mean, that's the thing that they wanted to make with this redraw change anyway, to make redraws more of a decision, because you have to be more conservative. For example, in redrawing with big combre, you have to ask yourself if it's really worth it to lose like 30% of the time. Is this hand worse than losing 30% of the time almost immediately if I redraw and hit the 2-power hand that doesn't do anything? You know? And that's actually, while the 30% chance of being close to that, which is a bit exaggeration, because that would mean like almost all 2-power hands that don't have a Find a Way or Seek are Death Sentences, which is also not true. There's plenty of hands that are still functional. There's Temple Scribe hands. There's also the cases where you just rip a bunch of power off the top and you're fine, or you even have like a bunch of 3s that buy you time and you just need to rip that 1 power and you maybe even on the draw. But sure, it actually gives you a real decision, because you have the risk of redrawing into a hand that is even worse, that is like 2 power and might get stuck on 2 or 3 and just doesn't win. So maybe that like mediocre first 7 is still a better keep because it has more power and is a better bet at winning than just redrawing into that dreaded 2-card hand. And that's, I think, the one thing they wanted to get from the redraws, to make it more of a decision. Well, before it was kind of like auto-click, because you would get the same hand as before, just with stronger limitations. You basically couldn't hit 1, 6, or 7, but you didn't have a higher chance at hitting 2 to 5 than with your first hand. So it basically just cut off the statistical extremes in your deck that almost no deck really wants, and gave you a second opening hand, while now the second opening hand is distinctly different from the first and generates more decisions. And that's I think the point and the goal they had with that. But there are issues with it that I addressed earlier, why that I dislike about it. But it also has its points, its upsides, because now it creates a decision. Now the first and the second hand are functioning distinctly different in their variance. They have it like both hands have variance, but both hands have distinctly different variance. While before, the first hand had 100% variance, 100% possible variance outcomes, and the redraw was basically the same kind of hand with the same kind of variance, just with like, I don't know, the bottom 10% and the top 20% chopped off. So you would only get like the core 70% of the variance of the first hand. So it's basically a snap redraw with every hand that is like below average. Because the outcome will be a random hand in a smaller spectrum of possible hands with like a higher density of good possible hands, because the worst outliers of the spectrum are cut off by the 6 and 7 power hands and 1 power hands.
Look, I mean, like, I think like,
and that's why they changed it.
People would play more power if their monuments just weren't so awful. Like people are willing to play, more proper power in time-based mid-range decks because, hey, you know, if you
Do
start
they?
flooding...
Do they? Look at the fucking illusion deck with 25 power with 4 monuments, and it still doesn't play any power. The deck is absurd.
Yeah, that is a bit absurd, you know, because Master Plan won 2 TCG esports tournaments in a row, and suddenly everyone just jumped aboard the Elysian mid-range wagon.
Missing Toes did that already at the Invitational before him. It's basically Missing Toes list.
Is it?
Yes, it's the list that Missing Toes lost with in the finals of the Invitational. He had the same power base. Not sure if the non-power cards are exactly the same, but they both have 4 monuments, 25 power, 0 diplomatic seal, which is also ridiculous. 4 initiate, 4 Amber Acolyte, 0 favorites, 0 seek, and they even fucking run Obelisk.
Right, I mean, like...
How are they ever even hitting 6 power for their Carnosaurs? Because their chance to hit 6 power is like they have 25 sources to actually hit 6 power. Their initiates are always gonna die or be silenced, and their monuments always turn into units on 5 power. So they basically have to get lucky to ever see a 6 power in a realistic game.
Well, I mean, like, sure, but I mean, like, Missing Toes wrote about that he went really optimistic with that Elysian mid-range.
I mean, Missing Toes honestly was on stream, I think during the Invitational on my stream in chat, and that he had like basically no idea and didn't see it that way and didn't understand it. And we had a power conversation on that stream while he was there, and he realized like how greedy and how bad it kind of was what he did. Not sure if he I think he ran it later, not sure if he changed anything, but it was basically a result of inexperience and lack of knowledge for the most part that he played the list and thought it was fine and seemed to understand more after listening to what I had to say on the matter, that was probably not the right and the smart solution to, and the way you should play it long term.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, like, I suppose hashtag never punished, you know, applies here. But it like he basically said, okay, the meta is going to be really slow, and people aren't going to be bringing a lot of fire.
You cannot count Amber Acolyte as 4 sources in a deck that doesn't have enough sources to hit 3 power. That's the whole point. If the 4 Amber Acolytes would be 4 Seek power instead, the power base would still be ambitious, but much more reasonable. The Amber Acolytes are like the cherry on top. Like, that's just a sick joke. I would laugh at a player that plays that deck so hard for every fucking time they sit there with 2 power and an Amber Acolyte in hand and would dance around them and be like, you fucking deserve to lose so hard. That's what I call justice.
I mean, look, I fully agree with that, but I think part of the reason that, you know, that people don't run enough power to your case, for example, is that the Stone Scar monuments are awful. Primal doesn't really have a primal centric, you know, a good up-tempo deck, so you don't see a lot of decks that can really make use of Cobalt.
That is
Monument.
true. To be fair, first of all, while Amethyst Monument is terrible, especially in the context of the type of deck the Stone Scar deck is, Granite Monument is not as bad as its rep. The card is reasonably playable. Because in the matchups that flood matters, that threat density matters, a 4-1 charge is a legit card. First of all, because you have Varus Favor to clean out random chaff that also already probably traded with your early drops, or got obliterated for free when you obliterated, nothing better to do, or jump blocked or whatever, or tried to gang block and got rapid shotted or annihilated or whatever, is that a lot of the times there will just not be anything there. You will be playing against other mid-range decks with mostly cards that you want to answer anyway, or like control decks with empty boards. So the Granite Monument's actually pretty reasonable. It's a much better card in my opinion than Caleb's Favor.
Sure.
And
for
the thing
example,
is,
like,
if you look at the list that Moosh and I played, we had like 1 monument in the main, and like, because we didn't want to run the 30-second power main, even though it was close, like when I played the deck, I was leaning towards a 30-second power, because that's how miserable it felt in the deck to not hit your 5th power for multiple turns when your hand is like obliterates and drakes. So half the time I played the deck, I played it with 32 power, and it felt better than with 31 for the most part. But then I figured like 31 should be kind of reasonable. Like 32 is already close to like a 6-drop deck, and the difference between 31 and 32 shouldn't be too noticeable, and it might make sense to, especially with people being so greedy, to slightly hedge. If the deck is like a 31.5 power deck, to rather just run 31.5. If it's a 31.5 power deck, to rather just run 31 than 32 and run like a 30-second power in the form of a monument in the board, because we had 6 drops in the board, because we had 2 Flamestokers to bring in against control, and then having an additional power to support our Flamestokers better and more consistently hit our stuff for Drakes, while also basically adding a shred and therefore basically a free power to the deck is good, and that's how that happened. But we even only had 1 monument in the deck, because the thing is, like, no matter how good the monuments are depleted power, which is bad in a deck that needs to curve out and is aggressive. It gets punished for example, not being able to play your champion on turn 3 because you have to fucking play a monument. Or like having the choice between playing your monument on turn 2 and not playing your Varus Favor to have your 3rd power, or playing your, like, I don't know, or playing it on turn 3, so your freaking 3-drop can't be played and stuff is just bad. And Moosh is like, yeah, I fucking hate depleted power, it's the worst in these decks. And to some extent I agree, but Varus Favor is just so fucking good that you have to play it. Because the card is like, most of the time a little 2-for-1, which is why it's fine. But that's like all the depleted power basically we wanted anyway. And the thing is, what was I trying to say? I'm trying to think of the point that I was trying to make. So the thing is that monuments have a significant downside in this game, especially because of how the redraw works. Thing is, especially the lower your actual power amount is. Like, running 4 and 25 is just nuts, basically. Even if you have a lot of extra, like, virtual power, like favors and seeks. First of all, these favors and seeks are all tap powers, like depleted powers or depleted plus powers, because favor is like a depleted power that costs you 1 on top of being depleted, basically. And seek is a depleted power. And that means you suddenly have like 1,000,001 slow power in your deck. The other thing is, if you have 4 and 25, keep in mind, your redraw gives you 2 to 4 cards out of these 25. So your ratio of monuments to like ready power is fairly high, the highest it can be, realistically, because you have the full 4 monuments, because you usually only run monuments from, assuming you only run monuments from 1 color, and then you maximum run 4. So you basically have like, what percentage is that? It's close to 20%. A little less. I think it is 15%? Is it 15%? No, 16%. I think it's 16% of your power is monuments. So you have a pretty high chance of having at least one of these monuments in your opening hand, especially, and it's even worse when you have lower amounts of power, or even get multiples. And the chance of in addition having the monuments affect your power otherwise negatively in regards to your seeds, getting more combinations of seeds plus non-sigils increases with the monuments in 25. Because And that's the other thing. Those people run the monuments instead of seals to not hurt their seeds more, which is absurd, because then you're making your power base even worse, because you're also fucking your influence in a deck that tries to hit triple time and double primal reliably by like turn 5 to 6, and already needs double time turn 2, which the deck without monuments, without seals, is only capable if it uses its monuments aggressively as time sources. And also runs for Initiative Descents with 8 3-drops that it can efficiently curve into, but then has 4 monuments that deny it that curving into, and also deprives itself of a full 4 turn 1 potential time sources in running 0 seals. Like, that deck has what, 12 turn 1 time sources for Initiate instead of the 16 that you need to reliably play a turn 1? And even if you get your turn 1, you get plenty of hands where your hand is like, do I play turn 1 Monument? Or do I play turn 1 Power plus Initiate, and then turn 1 Monument and still don't curve into my 3-drop and just play a 2-drop anyway, and basically wasted half of the ramp effect that Initiate provides me, because the most powerful ramp is the 1-3 and the 1-4 and the 2-4. And it's just absurd, and people don't get that and don't value that properly. And that's why I usually only run higher amounts of monuments with higher amounts of base power. Like, for example, if I run 4 monuments, I usually want at least 27 to 28 actual power and additional power. Like, for example, in a deck where I have, like, I don't know, Talia's Favored, like, for example, that old Praxis deck that I built before Set 2 release, I decided to use my monuments as split card, half the time power, half the time 5-drop. So I basically ran 25 plus 3 or 4 favored for Initiate for Amber Acolyte, basically the stock Obelisk Shimmer Pack style power base, because you had Flame Blast in the Shimmer Pack slot sort of to make extra use of the 8 power that you get for Obelisk. That's the other thing, by the way, why it's so absurd to see these Elysian lists, because they have the same or even rougher requirements than Shimmer Pack, except for the 2 8-drops. Like, do they really think not having 2 8-drops in their deck suddenly makes it mathematically feasible to casually cut 4 favors from your deck and also casually turn 4 of your ready power and sources that are power 100% of the time into 4 monuments? Like, what's up in people's head? Do they not even like compare decks and look at like, well, this deck roughly needs the same stuff as this deck, but my deck has like 2/3 of what that deck has, so maybe I'm running a little ambitious here? You know, like, I mean, it's obvious. There's so many references and already kind of historical things to look back on and see like, okay, if I play a deck with Obelisk that goes up to 6, I'm basically the Shimmer Pack style deck. So my deck kind of starts with 3 to 4 favors for Initiates, for Amber Acolytes, and maybe since I don't have 8-drops and my curve is like mildly flatter, I can maybe get away, especially because I have like Friendly Wisp as well. Maybe I can get away with a few monuments in those 25, because I don't need the hard 25, only like soft 25. Or maybe I can shave down to like 3 favored, which is still a bit iffy, because the 4 favored is what makes your Amber Acolyte as reliable as possible, because I think with 29 power you hit like the 90% 3 power on turn 3. I think with 28 you had like 86% on the play or something. I think with 29 powers between Zeke's favorites and power, you are at a bit over 90% on the play to have 3 power. Because you just cannot rely on your initiates. They just don't live often enough. And you don't really want to lose the game every time your opponent answers your initiate and you have an Amber Acolyte and needed that initiate to play that Acolyte and then just die.
Yeah, that's happened to me before. Like I needed an initiative of the Saints to survive to get to Amber Acolyte, and along came an enforcer and said, no, and then I'm just stuck on 2 power or something like that. It feels bad.
And one quick comparison between Elysian and Shimmer Pack once again. Shimmer Pack has 4 6-drops and 2 8-drops, but hardly any 5-drops. At least used to.
Correct.
Only had like 2 crystallized. While Elysian Midrange has 0 8-drops, but has at least 4 5-drops usually, and still 3 to 4 4-drops. What did I say?
Yeah, I mean, like,
what did I say?
Usually isn't a 5-drop.
Yeah, so I'm just counting Thurso. So it's 0 5-drops versus 4 5-drops. And still 3 to 4 6-drops, but a lot of the time Carnosaurs, not parties. So the parties basically get you to the 8 for the Shimmer Pack, so you can almost ignore the Shimmer Pack in the power calculation, except for maybe, okay, we don't have the Shimmer Pack, we are fine with 3 favored instead of 4. And that's it. And that's what the power base should look like 3 favored. And if you really want, really hard, maybe 1 or 2 monuments, but since you're having favored instead of actual power, your power is already slow because of the favored. So I just don't recommend adding random 5/5s to the deck, because the deck benefits more from running smoothly and curving out and then crystallizing the opponent out of the game than having that random extra 5/5 thrown in.
I mean, I suppose everyone's fear is that, you're in some sort of, you've been trading with your opponent all game long, and then they top deck a Reinhardt on you, and, you top deck 2 lands and, take 15 from a Reinhardt because you've just been top decking power. And, that is a very real concern that with the high power level of...
It's not a real concern. It's not as real of a concern, I think, as people think it is. Let me throw something a bit provocative and controversial out there, but I think a big reason why we see the things we see is because people aren't that good. Because making these deck building decisions and playing the decks the way they do play them takes away a lot of decisions. Because if you just skimp on power, either you run hot and your deck works, or you not, and then your deck doesn't. Either way, it's your deck's fault, it's not your fault. Because in a lot of these games that these people lose, that made them afraid of Flood, they didn't lose because of the Flood, they lose because they didn't play tight enough in their Flood to manage anyways. And I see that plenty of time in ETS. A lot of my games that I lose in ETS, I see my opponents playing questionably or poorly. And even in games that they Flood and I beat them, they play poorly and they could have done better and stuff like that, And that's just the way I see it. The greedy deck building, greedy power base thing takes away responsibility, because you can blame it on your deck not working and your deck either, and if you put yourself in a situation where your deck either works perfectly and wins for you because you're running hot, because when you don't have enough power in your deck, either your deck functions and then you're having the best possible draw in a way because your deck is not very likely to flood if it already gave you the base amount you need. That's why you have these decks these Stone Scar people that, hit their 4 or 5 power and then never draw any more power, because they were never supposed to hit the 5 power in the first place. But if they hit the 5 power, it's obviously like smooth sailing, because they're not too likely to hit the 6, 7s, and 8s too, because the deck is not even built to hit the 5. Them hitting 5 is already running well, so from there on out it's smooth sailing. And in the games where they never get past the 2 or the 3, or was it their fault that deck just screwed them?
Well, I mean, like that's the thing. Like, if you build your power, to draw smoothly, like to get to 5 smoothly all the time, then that means that if for some reason you miss your curve, like you draw, like you don't have a 1 or a 2 drop, and then your first drop is your Champion of Chaos that gets torched, and then your Doom gets, I don't know, annihilated, right? Suddenly you're already looking at hitting 5 power, and you haven't even done a point of damage.
Yeah, but that's a weakness of this style of aggressive approach, curving up that high. That's the danger and the problem, and that's also a bit alleviated by the fact that that this type of aggressive deck relies heavily on individual powerful cards, where almost every threat could win the game alone, backed up by spells. Because it needs that, because it needs to be able to win the game with the last threat standing. Because otherwise it can't work, because it can't work through pure aggression and tempo, because it is not fast enough for that, and it also doesn't have enough curve redundancy for that. But it gets the power, but it gets the power in return. Both these decks have different strengths and weaknesses. Like the lower curve deck has the inconsistency of like the draw, or your opponent drawing everything they need to line up perfectly against you and kind of get you to a grinding halt, and you not drawing every counter too. Like, for example, them hitting their best possible defensive curve, and you not drawing the bunch of answers that you put in your deck to line up with that curve, and then you are in trouble. But you're also much less likely to flood out, and you're also much faster and also much more punishing for that draw. That's like the other thing with the 0 versus 100 draw rating thing. There are decks that are obviously where you will have non-games. There will also be matchups in decks where even that bad monocolor sigil hand, monocolor hand of other cards where you can't play anything is not a non-game, because it's a matchup where it doesn't matter and a deck that doesn't punish you, and you just have time to draw out of it. But for example, I don't know, in a control mirror, as long as you have enough power, being color screwed can be super irrelevant if it stops at a point where it becomes critical and doesn't persist forever. While there are other matchups where this is punishing, but that's also a factor that makes certain decks have a certain appeal. Like aggro decks, one of the appeal of aggro decks is that they punish this. They punish decks that want to curve up higher, because decks that curve up higher naturally have more inconsistency in some way, because they can have these 6 and 7 drops in their opening hand and be virtual dead cards until turn 6 plus, if they even hit 6 by 6. So they profit from the fact that their opponent starts the game with virtual 4 to 5 relevant cards and a couple of cards that are sleepers in a way, and stuff like that. And that's all trade-offs, and these trade-offs are all important in how decks and archetypes and certain sizes of decks and certain kinds of curves and sizes of curves interact with each other and give you up and downsides. The curve of the Burn Queen style curving up to 5 deck gives you a lot more individual card power, but it also gives you a lot less consistency in curving and in aggression, more potential to flood because you need more power to support all your 5 drops. And if you pretend you don't, that also costs you, because then you will die with your Obliterates and Drakes in hand. And the other deck has less individual card power. Like if the opponent can easily play one card that virtually blanks my entire early game. Like against the Titan deck with that Stone Scar deck, there can be scenarios where I have 3 or 4 units in play and they are all virtually blank from one Titan. And as soon as I get an answer to that Titan, they are all live again. But the opponent's 1/4 drop has the potential to blank all my 1/2/3 drops. And that's something that is obviously less likely to happen to the Burn Queen style deck, but it has other issues.
Yeah,
This is all trade-offs.
Like, you know, my question is, you know, like...
Can
you're
you hold
aware
your
of, like,
thought
the
for a
double-
second? Can you hold your thought for a second? I'm almost pissing my pants.
Oh,
I
yeah,
really
go
need to
ahead.
take a piss,
I'll
so
wait.
just hold your
Yeah, okay,
thought. I'll
okay.
be right back.
Okay, I'll wait for a minute. Okie dokie. I can talk to chat. I think there's like a 20-second delay. So if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to fire them off. But essentially, you know, my question is, yeah, it is a ghost chair. That like, what effect on the game would something like Dorcia? Yeah, like on ladder, I've been running across some people, like, you know, like multiple times a day. Not just like once or twice, but playing the same person like 3 or 4 times a day. Like there's this user, Seymour Butts.
I am back.
SEY, like the name Seymour, and then
Yeah, Seymour Butts. What's with him?
You're back.
What's with him?
Yeah, Dorcia. Yeah.
What's about Seymour Butts?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Dorcia Seymour Butts, but there's this user playing Huru Control that I ran into him like 4 or 5 times in a day, and it's like, holy crap, like how few people are playing this game. He had a Z at the end of his name, but you know, never mind that. Like, essentially, my question is, like, we know the double nickel shuffle in Magic is illegal because it gives you the perfect mana. But at the same time, you know, it always feels bad when you flood or screw out, you know, in a deciding game in a tournament, or even any game in a tournament, because, you know, players are too good to just spot one game and then reverse sweep them in a BO3 or something to that nature. And I'm thinking, you know, if we have something between completely random power draws and perfect double nickel shuffle, you know, for power leading in Eternal, like imagine the following algorithm.
The thing is, I said that already at the beginning when you tried to bring that up. You just making a bad version of freaking like Hearthstone resource system or whatever. There should not be this much consistency and reliability in your resource system in this game. That's just not how this is supposed to work, and that does lead the whole system ad absurdum. And I think trying to inherently change the resource system, or appealing to change the resource system and how the resource system works in this game, makes no sense and is not gonna happen, because that's what the game is about. What is a reasonable thing to talk about is maybe getting more ways to control some of that variance in deck building, like some more scry type stuff, maybe some more nice cards that are good early, good late, in the sense of like flood protection, like some more good ultimate cards that are balanced but good enough for constructed, like Pyro Knight, for example. Pyro Knight, since it got nerfed in closed beta, is a very nice and very balanced, well done example of a card that scales well and mitigates some of the variants in the game. Like initial Pyro Knight was a bit too good because then the ultimate was less of a bonus and more of a feature. Because getting to 5 was
that's
very
why the card
realistic.
is rare.
It was too
like
fucking
Pyro
good.
Knight-
Like when you have a card that is basically not bad in any stage of the game, really, then the card becomes too good. Then you have like this universal thing, and that's not very good. Then you have like the Death Ride Shaman issue, basically. But having a card
Oh,
that is like average in its main role, average or a bit above average in its main role, plus scaling well and kind of covering your ass at a point in the game that you don't want to hit but can hit, is a good thing. And that's why they made that change, because the first version was just a bit too pushed, and the ultimate basically happened too often and made the card a bit like too good no matter what. And now you have this like 1-drop that is like not the best 1-drop, but it's a fine 1-drop. It has some upsides because the overwhelm sometimes comes up with combat tricks and stuff. And you have plenty of games. You have like the games where you draw normal power and it's still just a 2-1 and doesn't do anything other than what you would expect from a 1-drop. But then you have these games where you draw more power than your deck actually wants, because almost all Pyro Knight decks don't naturally want 6 power. But that's why it's perfect. Like a lot of these, like a bunch of Pyro Knight decks actually want 5 power, which is why it's important that Pyro Knight's ultimate doesn't cost 5. Because if the deck wants 5 power and still can run Pyro Knight, it probably shouldn't get Pyro Knight on 5 as well. But basically, it doesn't want 6, but if 6 happens, it's still fine a lot of the time, because you have that Pyro Knight that you can suddenly turn into a good late game threat, because it 6 power, basically, considering the Pyro Knight dead at that point in the game, because it's blanked, means that you basically, drawing your 6 power gives you a card economy-wise free 6/5 overwhelm for 6. Which seems like a very fair monument, like a pretty solid monument, basically.
well, I mean, like,
And that's why it's extremely well done and extremely well balanced, and why that nerf was very good. And we need more cards like that. Because that's a good way to mitigate flood and balance being light on power early on and being like flooded later, and stuff like scry options and other like favor type cards, other like monument type cards. Maybe we get like some power cycle that is not monuments, but that transmutes into a spell, into like a mediocre spell.
Well, I mean, like the thing is, even if we got more, transmute type power, they're always going to come into play depleted. So that really doesn't solve the issue. Like,
It does. It just is a cost. I would just wish some of the
look,
monuments were a bit better. Like
look,
the
the
black
thing
monument.
is, like, I always thought that Pyro Knight at 5 was a fair card in the context of Constructed. Because, in Constructed we have a 5/6
Yeah, real
or
milkman,
4,
that's a pretty
6
good point. That's what I'm trying, among others, what I mean. That's why I feel like Eternal is a bit more variance prone right now and feels a little more variance heavy, because there's like a lot less cards that let you do things with your mana, basically. It doesn't have to be too powerful things, it doesn't have to be like Seraph power level things, but just things to do. Like, for example, we have, to be fair, Tireless Tracker is not the best example, because I think Tireless Tracker is one of the more borderline questionable cards in the recent history. I'm not sure how much I like Tracker, because Tracker had like some obnoxious potential to just take over games and run away with the games in a too extreme fashion for my liking, I think. The card just
so
often
Tireless
felt pretty
Tracker,
obnoxious.
let me get this straight. It's basically a miniature Mystic Ascendant.
Well, it costs you a lot of power, because every card draw costs you 2.
Sure.
So it's a super slow Ascendant. So it's basically
Sure.
only an Ascendant in matchups where you have all the time in the world, and it's really grindy. And in other matchups, that's how it's balanced, because in other matchups it's actually pretty bad, because it's a 3-2 for 3, which is pretty bad. The card's really bad when you're under pressure, and it's pretty good when you are the aggressor against like a control deck where it's really grindy. Which is why a lot of decks didn't even run 4. Like a lot of decks even only ran 2 or 3 main deck, because the card is either really bad and hurting you a lot, because playing it on turn 3 means it's almost the same as skipping your turn in some matchups, and in other matchups it's just like the nut.
Oh, yeah, I mean, like, I see what you're saying. But,
That's the only way why the card is not completely obnoxious, because it's balanced that way, but the card has like some still like this kind of this high variance. It's either like extremely obnoxious or kind of crap, and I rather like my cards to be a bit more balanced around the middle and less less counterbalance their how powerful they can possibly be and how game dominating by making them shit in other situations, because it's just nicer if they don't just single-handedly win. If your 3-drop just never single-handedly wins you the game this hard, I think.
Well, I mean, like thing is, in like Eternal, for example, like, you know, take you know, Stone Scar, like in general,
Investigate is a nice way to attach cantrips to cards that otherwise couldn't have cantrips, because having an actual cantrip on that card would be too good, because it would make the card too efficient, but basically giving you the option to make the card have a cantrip if you are willing to invest 2 mana more into the card, because you have the time to do so and the mana to do so, is nice. So you're either getting like a slightly more expensive regular version of the card, or an extremely more expensive cantrip version of the card, in a way.
But I mean, like, you know, I suppose that's one thing that frustrates me about what DWD is doing. For example, like the Inspire nerf, like turned it from, hey, you know, we have something to do, you know, late game because we can, you know, cycle this cantrip, you know, so to speak. And DWD is like, oh, too many
what
people
are you talking about?
Inspire.
Inspire.
Like, yeah, like we're gonna nerf Inspire to the point that it's not playable.
How is Inspire even a relevant example to this?
Well, like you're saying, you know, things to do, you know, like with filtering and, you know.
Yeah, I talked about actual cards that have things to do attached. A random 1-mana cantrip does not fit that criteria at all. That's just making your deck thinner. That's has nothing to do with the topic in any way.
Okay, sure, but like, what, like, would you add like an ultimate to Oni Ronin, for example? Like, would you give Oni Ronin, say, 6 power, you know, it gains +4 and quick draw, for instance, because people would howl to the moon, you know, if Oni Ronin could suddenly be relevant late game, or if you gave Rakano Outlaw, you know, a 6 power ultimate, you know, game.
Why are you asking this? I didn't suggest anything like that. Because those are both cards that are clearly pushed in the early game and therefore suck in the late game, and that's how they're balanced. Pyronite is not particularly good as a 1-drop, just basically a vanilla 2-1 with a semi-relevant overwhelm. So it's obviously like on the level of, as a 1-drop, it's on the level of Relentless Stranger. But it has that upside attached to it. Oni Ronin is a prime 1-drop that has no upside attached in the late game, because it has incredible upside in the early game by Warcry. Same for Outlaw, so these are very poor examples. But yeah,
I mean, you know, when people say we need things to do with our power, it's not like, you know, it's not like a Stone Scar is then going to, you know, put a bunch of mediocre units in its deck so it can have a little more flood protection. Because if you're getting to 6 or 7 power, you know, and you're Stone Scar against big Combrade,
also
that game is already looking grim.
Also, ultimates are only one. Ultimates are only one example of this. Also, most aggro decks and most aggro units shouldn't have ultimates, because giving aggro decks too many ultimates is a good recipe for breaking a game. But giving non-aggro decks, non-aggressive cards that are kind of mediocre but do something early on. An ultimate to do something late game is nice, for example. Or not even an ultimate, like some minor reusable ability, just stuff to do that your card can generate value for you, not even necessarily card advantage, just some kind of use some kind of value with your power, be it like some kind of damage to the opponent or some kind of combat interaction. There's just a bunch of things that a card can do if you sink power in it. That doesn't necessarily does something broken, like generate hard card advantage or anything, but does something, advance your game or your game plan in a way if you have spare power. We have some of those cards in the new set. They're all not very great examples for constructed, but we started seeing cards that have repeatedly usable high-cost abilities like Fire Main or High Wind Glider and stuff. These are the direction that I'm talking about. They are just not the best constructed relevant examples, but that's the kind of thing we are talking about. We just need things
Sure,
like that,
but
but
here's
more,
the thing.
but in a balanced way for constructed that kind of like do something. It's just not we just don't have good examples for that. We have some examples for that yet so far, but they're all pretty conservative and too conservative to be good enough or relevant in constructed. That's the problem. The Praxis
Hey,
2-drop is
Manu, I
close,
have to
but only
go
close.
right now. Let's pick this conversation up in the future, okay?
Okay, sure. I
Okay.
think or
thanks a lot.
hope the
Bye-bye.
audience enjoyed it. So thanks
Yep.
for joining us and talk to you later.
Yep.
Bye.
Hello. Yes.
All right. So there we are on our own again with IlyaK out. But yeah, I think we're seeing Direwolf slowly move in that direction. We got a conservative scry on a couple of cards. We got reusable abilities on some cards. We got some repeatedly activatable cards like the rings. The only problem I have is that most of the things with scry and reusable stuff on it were too conservative to be good in constructed. But I think they are trying to not basically make the Smuggler's Copter mistake that Magic made. They had a new mechanic they thought was cool and they pushed it to make it relevant and impactful and cool, and they pushed it too far, and the new mechanic just completely took over and demolished standard. And that's not a good thing to happen. So if you want to introduce new things in a game, it's probably a bit better to be careful and scale it into the game rather than just blow it up in the middle of the game and make it kind of dwarf everything that was there before, you know?